Kia ora tātou whānau. It's good to have you back. As part of this series of radicalisation and extremism podcasts, as I said, I'm going to be interviewing some really interesting people over the next sort of 3 or 4 months. And the person I'm interviewing today is Professor Edwina Pio. And please listen to the intro as we go into the main body of the podcast. She's an amazing person, and some of the things that she says are quite insightful. But today's topics and discussion points, or korero, will be around the importance of diversity and inclusiveness within intelligence sort of frameworks, and how do we counter extremist views? How important is diversity and inclusiveness? You know, we look at the whole concept of community strategic leadership frameworks. We consider extremism within the New Zealand society. And we talk about how important it is for us to consider a society approach, sort of extending from what Dr. Aaron Salton had said there. It will take a whole societal approach to address and respond to radicalisation extremism. We also have a look at the potential for radicalisation in secondary and tertiary institutions and high schools and universities, and what the potential is for extremist thinking and radicalisation. And we're lucky in this particular instance, Professor Pio is actually part of the ministerial advisory group that was set up to respond to the Christchurch terrorist attacks. And we'll talk about some of the learnings and some of the things that she's been able to observe and share with us. So with that, without further discussion, I'd like to sort of introduce Professor Edwina Pio and say at this stage that we want to mihi once again to all those that have been impacted by extremism, by violence, and particularly to the families and our whole society. So kia ora whānau, looking forward to getting on with this interview.
Kia ora whaia. It's lovely to have you here with us today. I have the honour of introducing to those who are watching this korero, Professor Edwina Pio, and I need to say this in the first place. I'm a huge fan of your work and who you are as a person, and so it's with great pleasure that I have an opportunity to spend some time with you. And in the first place, I just wanted people to know a little bit about who you are and what you've done, and I'm just going to go through your introduction and just allow you to respond to it. Then we'll get into the interesting topic of radicalisation and extremism. So Professor Pio is a woman of peace and prayer, a scholar of colour, and a passionately engaged educator. Edwina brings grace, gratitude, courage, and thoughtfulness to governance, teaching, research, doctrinal supervisions, and stakeholder engagement. She wakes up to the wonder of each day with an awareness of infinite possibility. Her mana in bearing witness to difference and walking the margins provides wider legitimacy for diversity, creating pivot points and safe passage to walk through awkward diversity terrain. With dignity and respect, she has unsettled disciplinary boundaries to rupture glass, concrete, and bamboo ceilings, providing inspiration and contributing to the national discourse on social cohesion in the pluro-ethnic, pluro-religious, volatile world. Recipient of a Royal Society Medal and Duke of Edinburgh Fellowship, Fulbright alumna, is New Zealand's first Professor of Diversity, University Director of Diversity, and elected councillor on the governing body of the Auckland University of Technology. A prolific writer, her research is published in leading international journals and media outlets. She's written over half a dozen books. Her early book, Sari Indian Woman at Work in New Zealand, released by Sir John Key, and recently Reimagining Faith and Management, was released by a Minister for Diversity and Inclusion and Minister for Workplace Safety. Edwina has been appointed to the Ministerial Advisory Group pertaining to the Royal Society recommendations on the Christchurch mosque shootings, and to the Rutherford Discovery Fellowship Humanities and Social Sciences panel. She was a speaker at APEC's Voices of the Future and Workplace Diversity, Equity and Inclusion conference. And if I can just say this humbly, I consider her a friend and someone I very much look up to. And I think when I went through the introduction the other day and I looked at it, I thought, wow. But I thought, well, because, words are words, and I've gotten to know you over a period of time. And it's that wairua that connects with the both of us. And from my perspective, you are all of what's been written and far more and much more. And so I wanted to mihi to you at this stage and just say with a bit of humility that I'm very grateful that you could participate in this podcast series, to talk about something really serious. So with that, kia ora whaia, it's lovely to have you here. And I'll let you take a minute to respond.
Thank you, Gareth. Kia ora, mai no tātou katoa, ko Edwina Pio tāku e noa. He tangata tiriti aho, no reira tēnā tātou katoa. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, Gareth. And of course, the connection, as you mentioned, of Wairua and the work that we both do in the area of alternative perspectives to a primarily Western homogenized way of looking at things is perhaps something that does bind us together. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
Kia ora whaia, and I think that's a wonderful segue to begin with, is that a very key part of what we're doing through this series is to look at challenging set beliefs and ideals, which tend to be a little bit Eurocentric, a little bit sort of Western paradigm orientated, but to think about alternate views and to think about other perspectives when we talk about radicalization and extremism. And obviously, what unfortunately does also bind us together is the terrible attack that occurred on March 15th, 2019, where our brothers and sisters, members of our New Zealand community, members of the Muslim community, and just human beings that are so important to their families and to us is what also binds us. And I do want to say in the first place, we want to mihi to them and acknowledge them. And we want to sort of honor them by continuing to talk about how we can avert and detract away from that type of evil which did occur, and how we can actually honor them into the future by always remembering who they are and remembering their families. And so thank you, Edwina, for sort of, I guess, introducing that other alternative perspective. And so I guess I've got a question around this concept of diversity and, what does enhancing effectiveness and understanding and diversity and inclusiveness mean? Because this is very much about who you are. What does it actually mean?
Diversity is fun, funky, and formidable. And it's a word that's tossed around, pushed under the carpet as people grapple with difference, whether it's in organizations or in societies or among people in intra and interpersonal matters. In its simplest avatar, diversity is difference. I think many of us as human beings do like stasis or inertia, Newton's law, and change often means fear, threat, the unknown. When we look at diversity as difference, it could denote gender, age, religion, marital status, sexual orientation, ethnicity, political beliefs, intelligence, etc. Diversity does play a very important part in the implementation of values and good citizenship behavior, while also enhancing social mobility, social cohesion, and importantly, also a higher profitability and safety footprint. I think we need both. Profitability is not a bad word. We need that in order to be able to enhance the safety toolkit, if I might call it that, and the strategies that we have for enhancing heartprints and footprints for diversity, for safety. In the context of New Zealand, we need to focus on possibilities. We've changed so quickly in the last few years, but we also need tactical brilliance beyond an innocent analysis and tectonic slowness, where champions of conservatism adhere to medieval mindsets in 21st century Aotearoa. We have to learn to move out of our own homogeneous cages, to sing and learn to syncopate to new heterogeneous rhythms. We are a small country, a beautiful country. As of May 2nd, 2022, our population was 4.8 million, which is equivalent to 0.06 of the total world population, and a fairly young median age of 38 years. We also have a very rich diversity of ethnicities, with Europeans continuing to be the dominant percentage of around 70%. We have Maori, the indigenous people, at 16.5%, Pacifica peoples 8.1%, Asian 15.1%, and Middle Eastern and Latin American peoples 1.5%. So we are, in fact, a very heterogeneous country. And I'd also like to emphasize that in this heterogeneity, we have tremendous religious diversity. And I'm emphasizing that because of the Christchurch attack. Though more than 2 million New Zealanders say they have no religion, yet about 37% identify with Christianity, 2.6% with Hinduism, 1.32% with indigenous Maori. Now here's something to keep in mind. Only 1.3% identify with Islam, 0.86% with Sikhism, and we also know that there's a fair amount of anti-Semitism, and therefore I thought I would share that percentage with you as well, which is 0.11%. Oh. So therefore, I think we have to remember that diversity is not political correctness. It is an insurance policy, but it has to be more than box ticking and window dressing. We all have unconscious biases. We all have our patterns of historical tradition, our patterns of biases, which often mean a blithe ignorance of cultures. And that is where we've got to emphasize certain pivot points. I'm just going to mention 4. First of all is diversity enlargement. Who do we have in our organizations? While we are all crying out for international students, how do we really treat them? And how do we enfold them in our societies and organizations? I think we've also got to have diversity sensitivity, which is beyond only wonderful food and wonderful ethnic garments. We've also got to talk about difficult issues when we look at diversity sensitivity. 2 more points: diversity leadership, which is the linchpin to fulfill diversity's promise. Whether the leadership is from universities, from organizations, from government, we need all 3. And also agency of individuals. And finally, diversity audit. I think in our country, quite often, we do a lot of wonderful things, but we don't necessarily track how we implemented it, and therefore, how do we realign what happens with that? The last point I'd like to mention is that I think New Zealand, unlike I might say many other countries around the world, we are very, very committed to being a country at peace, or he whenua tarikura. And in June last year, as part of our multi-pronged strategy, we had a conference to ensure that we are a safe and inclusive country. Gareth, that's it from me for the first question that you asked. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Fire. I think there's so much that you can unwrap from that and sort of unbundle and pull together as different sort of segments of real focus. But there's this key thing that stands out when we think about radicalization extremism or how to counter extremist views, and that's that concept of social cohesion. That idea that the interviews I've had to date, quite often we traverse or we move back to this idea that it's not just the intelligence community that should be dealing with it. It's not just the government. It's not just the tech companies. It's not just communities at large. It's a whole community, social cohesive approach. And so when we think about diversity and we think about the key principles of what you're talking about, how do you think specifically these baseline principles can help with social cohesion when we think about counter extremist views? I mean, what are some practical things that you think we could do?
I think I mentioned a few a little earlier in terms of diversity enlargement, recruiting employees from diverse backgrounds. The government is in fact encouraging ethnic peoples to apply for posts within the government. Because if you look at different audits that have been conducted in the last few years, gender is top of the list, which is wonderful. And we have now the rank of 4 in the Global Gender Gap Report from the World Economic Forum, which is absolutely wonderful. But in that, what's the ethnic mix? And I think that's important to look at. We also need to have more ethnic people on boards so that you get a different point of view, and therefore diversity leadership as well. So I think those are important aspects that we need to look at. And we have to be able to be brave as well as respectful when talking about difference. So I do have issues with how we pick up different things and talk about it. I think it's so important that we also honor other points of view respectfully.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think I can move that through to a statement that was made in the Royal Commission report, and I've shared it with you prior to this meeting. But there is a recommendation. It's in the summary component of the Royal Commission report, and it states, and I quote, "We conclude that the concentration of counter-terrorism resources on the threat of Islamist extremist terrorism before the New Zealand Security Intelligence Services baselining project began in May 2018 was inappropriate because it, A, was not based on an informed assessment of the threats of terrorism associated with other ideologies, and B, did not result from a system-wide decision that, despite the absence of such an assessment, counter-terrorism resources should continue to be allocated almost exclusively to the threat of Islamist extremist terrorism." And so what we do know prior to May 2018 is that we were heavily weighted to the concept of looking at the bad actor or the bad guy or bad person as being someone of Islamic origins that had been radicalized. And so I think we've talked about the things that you've talked about boards or governance have to have sort of ethnicity. And I guess that ethnicity may challenge current ideologies, and we'll talk about that in a second. But, when we look at specifically the intelligence community, and with your work over the last sort of several years and working on the committee and reviewing what happened in Christchurch, you made a statement that the government is making changes. Are you seeing enough? Are you seeing changes which are occurring? Are you seeing not just the governance changes, but the leadership changes right down to the operational levels? Is there anything that you could share with us so that we can counter that whole concept of being locked into a single channel of viewing only one ideology as being the bad actor?
Thank you for that question and for putting it in the context, Gareth. That's very helpful. I think if you look at the leadership in the government, in the different departments, in the government and in the top leaders in organizations as well as education institutions, they primarily are of a certain ethnicity and a certain background. And we are all a result of our past experiences. And therefore, in that context, I would tend to agree that there is need to broaden what we think of and who we look at and the groups we look at in terms of radicalization and violent extremism. And I think that this occurs on a continuum. It would be very inappropriate to look at only one particular group. Be that as it may, that certain ethnic groups, certain diasporic communities do tend to have a higher percentage, if you will, if you look at the published data of terrorist attacks. With reference to our own country, Aotearoa, 10 days after the devastating attack in 2019, the government announced that a Royal Commission of Inquiry would be set up. And as we know, that is reserved only for matters of the gravest public importance. Collectively, the implementation of the 44 recommendations are meant to contribute to the overarching requirement of New Zealand and our vision to have a diverse, we are already diverse, inclusive, and safe New Zealand. The work program is organized across 5 themes, and this was agreed by Cabinet in November 2021. And if it's okay with you, Gareth, I would like to spend a little time talking about 5 themes.
Thank you.
I might add that information about what I'm sharing is available publicly on the Department of the Prime Minister's website, DPMC, and anyone can access that information. So each recommendation is related to one of these 5 themes. The first one, and Gareth, both you and I have been speaking about that, which is social cohesion, education, and inclusion. And under this is, what is the strategic framework that can adapt to and embrace New Zealand's changing demography and diversity to ensure that diverse perspectives and experiences are represented and, importantly, also included in government and the education sector. In terms of an action point, I'd like to mention the Ministry for Ethnic Communities was established on 1st July 2021 with a new chief executive, Mervyn Singham, and I've worked with him over many years in the past and look forward to continuing that work with him. We've also got a rollout of community learning hubs and piloted delivery of social emotional learning initiatives. So that's the first theme, social cohesion, education, and inclusion. And I know we'll be talking more about education a little later, so I won't go into any further details here. The second theme is reducing hate-motivated crime and racism. So there have, for example, been instances of, in some parts, unfortunately, of our beautiful island country, of people, for example, pulling the headscarves of women, of shouting at people who look different from the majority, saying, go home to your country, etc. Now, we must remember that in New Zealand, we have people who are not white, who are 4th, 5th generation New Zealanders, beyond, of course, our tangata whenua. So how do we reduce hate-motivated crime and racism? And I think here the government is seeking to strengthen laws on hate speech, hate-motivated offenses, and also objectionable material. We have, which the police is developing, the Tiraranga program, and Tiraranga means the weave. It's a victim-centric approach to hate crime, to revise the way in which police respond to and record hate-motivated offenses. So as a person of the public, if, for example, I experience hate, and many of us do, particularly those of us who work in this area, what is the system of reporting so that it is not cumbersome? And that's something that the government is seeking to work on so that If someone complains, it doesn't fall through the cracks between different organizations and different parts of the government. The third theme, firearms and safety implementation. Now, some time ago, The Economist published information about the percentage of firearms that a country has in the population. And surprise, surprise, New Zealand had a lot of firearms. The reason for that is because we are an agricultural country. And that is one of the reasons why there were a lot of firearms. But we are having changes to the firearm system to ensure that the risk of inappropriate people having firearms is limited, and ensuring that communities have resources to advance their safety. And that was implemented very soon after the Christchurch attack. It is still ongoing because there are still a lot of arms and weaponry in the communities. Fourth theme, countering terrorism and violent extremism implementation. And this theme, in fact, is dear to my heart because I think there is much we've got to do in this area through legislative change, through public engagement, through strategy, importantly through research, and research that looks at countries not only, and I'm going to use the word, the traditional countries of Europe, and in Europe, primarily Northern Europe, of UK, USA. But we also need to look at other countries. And therefore, I think the government has introduced Heranga Ake, a multi-agency preventative approach to identifying persons of concern, reduce the likelihood of them causing harm, and to support individuals who may be at risk of radicalization. This also includes cybercrime and anti-money laundering. The last theme is the national security system implementation. And under each of these themes, we can link different recommendations. I'm not reading them out because that would be too complex when we look at 44 of them. Under the national security system implementation, there is reform of the national security sector, the structure of national security agencies, monitoring and governance structures. How do we share practices? How do we take a more strategic approach to national security? And how do we engage with the public on national security risks? And this is an ongoing program, including topic consultation on the national security long-term insights briefing. So for those of you who might choose to watch this video, you're welcome to go to the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet website. Just put in DPMC New Zealand and you'll find a lot of information over there, which is extremely helpful to understand the context within which we operate. Thank you, Gareth.
Oh, thank you. I think because you've raised it, I'm going to respond to it because I think it's really important that we have a look at the 5 things that we've talked about, but applying that sort of alternate view and worldview and also a different type of thinking in the work I've done in the past or in terms of analyzing, looking at intelligence, quite often to ensure that we weren't trapped with our own biases, we'd set up things such as red teams, and red teams in some circles amongst the intelligence community is a way of checking, I guess, the way that a group of people will think about something, but having an alternate way of viewing things and challenging the status quo. And quite often in some of the stuff that the intelligence community will use that quite often to check assumptions all the way through to ensure that they're not getting caught out by following something which is not factual, not correct, and it's basically based off an incorrect assumption. Sometimes those assumptions occur because the baseline, the entity or organization that the intelligence community are working in, they work for them and they work under that particular sort of umbrella. So my point here to talk about what you've just gone through is that this is still government driven. so what I'm saying is that it's sponsored by government, it's maintained by government. Government basically are the payroll, and the counter to that is that I can see potential compromise in the viability or the credibility. And I say this as the devil's advocate here, is that when something is totally government sponsored and orientated, we're going to get outcomes which are going to respond to a government entity. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but what I am sort of introducing here is that is there a sweet spot with a combination of government, of community, of tech organizations, where the establishment and the countering and the prevention of these ideologies start at going back to that whole sort of like society approach, and that it's being sponsored by a fairly wide group of entities, as opposed to being just government driven. And I'm not saying that's incorrect, but I'm saying from an alternate view, is there potential when we look at these things where it's purely being supported by just government, and these committees are being formed by government, they're selecting the groups of people that go onto the committees, and are they, do these committees include people from Facebook, from Microsoft, from Twitter? Do they include people from tech industries? Are they including iwi? Are they including even the voices which challenge the far left to the far right? Are we looking at a whole spectrum? So I want you to sort of like, if you can just take a second, just think about that, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Gareth. It is a very critical question. And I think what the government is trying to do, when you say government supported, the word supported can be unpacked in a number of different ways. So supported because of finance. If the government doesn't support that with finance, our community is going to be able to support. Just as an example, the security systems in mosques, who's paying for that? I'm putting that question out there. Okay. And I think that's important because the government does provide resources. But on the other hand, I think they are trying, and I underscore the word trying, there's still a long way to go, to do consultation with communities. And this is much more widespread than it was in the past. Yeah. The second thing that I'd like to mention over here, so one is consultation with communities. And as you know, I'm part of the Ministerial Advisory Group. We have been quite persistent in emphasizing that the consultation is widespread and that it's done in a way that communities feel they can come and talk to government officials as well as to community officials who might be there. I think also that the government is much more open now to looking at alternative points of view. Because say what you might, the fact that we have so many, martyrs, as they are called in the Islamic tradition, based on what happened in Christchurch, we don't want a repetition of that. And close on the heels of that was the Newlyn aspect. If you look at the Newlyn knife attacks, the government had already spent millions on that. But because of our legislative system, and I might say also, and here I might not be so politically correct, because of the fact that we are so concerned about treating each person with dignity, sometimes what happens with one person and what happens with many. Do you need to make sacrifices in a certain area in order to protect the larger majority? So that's a difficult conundrum. But I think also it's a number of groups that have to work together: the justice system, the police, the intelligence, and I might emphasize faith-based communities as well. And I'm using the term faith-based communities because they are not necessarily fundamentalist communities. But many people do not understand the frameworks from within which they operate. I liked your suggestion also, Gareth, that I think it's important that we include people. who are on a continuum, if you will, of radicalization or fundamentalism, the alt-right, for example, but people also have to be prepared to come to the table. And people also have to be prepared to treat each other with dignity and respect. I think if I have the right to say certain things, I also have to be able to have the right to see that what I say does not negatively impact or take away the rights of other people. And I think I would like to emphasize that in our wonderful democracy, in a place where women have so much of freedom, which isn't the case in many other parts of the world. So it's a complex issue. I would, however, like to say that, I mean, hats off to our government for moving along in this area, for putting up so much of information in the public arena, and for treading carefully. They need to move much faster, but that's just me. Thank you, Gareth.
No, thank you. And I think from a Māori perspective, or the concept of how we deal with conflict or issues which might be tribal orientated or iwi orientated, is that we might organise a hui as an example, and in that hui, or that meeting, that gathering where people come together on the marae or our meeting places, is that, you know, kanohi ki te kanohi, or that face-to-face is really important for us, where on the pai, or where we get up and speak and respond to each other, we might hear introductions, we might hear whakapapa attaching us to where we've come from, but we have an opportunity to also express how we feel and how we view things. And I find that the hui environment, while it can get quite fired up when someone says something that someone disagrees with, ultimately there's a lot of aroha, love, manaki, hospitality, and wairua spirit in those meetings. And so hopefully at the end of that whole process, we end up with something where people can walk away with a whanangatanga of sorts about in relationships, agreeing to do something going forward. So I think what you've just said is really important. The emphasis is that, you know, whether it's law enforcement, intelligence, government, community, and I would suggest companies, tech industries, and bringing businesses into this whole concept. You know, how can we improve things and allow the concept of companies which are in that particular space may be impacted to also contribute, because some of our very best analysts or intelligence people are actually working in private companies, and they're doing analysis every single day on data research for markets and understanding the buying patterns and selling patterns and all sorts of things. And so I like what you've just said about bringing this all together. So I think one thing I'd like to go into, and it's something that we've talked about, and I have a bit of an education background. I work with student associations, and I've experienced and I've seen some pretty extreme views from time to time within these student associations or on campuses. And I've sat back and I've gone, oh wow. And so I guess the question I've got here is that there is the potential within education itself, and I'm talking about tertiary and secondary. And this is the phenomena that occurred with Daesh and ISIS, where many young people up in the UK were being radicalized, and they were at secondary schools, they're at tertiary institutions. And we bring it back to New Zealand or the Pacific, or this particular region. You know, what do you believe we can do better in terms of addressing extremism, potentially in secondary and tertiary institutions? You know, how do we approach that type of thinking and development? I'll stop there.
Gareth, thanks. Before I go into details of that, I would like to respond to what you said about companies and organizations. I would like to see the government doing much more in that area. And also, when I say consultation, who is community? Community is not only people in the not-for-profit sector. It's also people in the for-profit sector. And I would definitely like to see the government doing much more consultation with. We spend so much of our time at work, whether it is at homes doing it online, or whether it is in the geographical or physical location. And I think government has to consult much more with with the business communities, and the business communities also have to feel that they can contribute in that area. And the other point I would like to make is, while I totally agree with Hui and the Marae, the importance of Manakitanga, we are all Kaitiakitangas, Kaitiaki for Kaitiakitanga. I think it's important that we move away from sharp dichotomies, but we have to have East-West joining hands in a weave, because we are all part of, if I use Mason Dury's term, of a woven universe. And I think that is so important, that we have in this woven universe a sacred ecology of relationships. And it is in that context, I think, that tertiary institutions have a very important role to play. Secondary institutions, educational institutions in general, in terms of moving forward and addressing difficult issues. Universities are meant to be places of inconvenient doubt, because we have people who are researchers, people who question things. If we look at data in terms of terrorism and people who have committed terrorist attacks, we would find that the majority of them are millennials. Where do we have the majority of millennials? In universities. And therefore, it is so important to be able to do something about this beyond virtue signaling. We've got to really move in terms of talking about difficult issues in a safe way. The millennials are a group who are very internet savvy. Yet, because of them being internet savvy, they could be impacted by echo chambers. And we all know what happens with that, that you get the repeated messages coming up to you. And quite often the terrorist groups, if I might use that term, have many more resources and much more savvy than what our governments and organizations have. They are much more nimble and much more agile. And I think, therefore, universities have to be proactive. We have the privilege of educating and learning with thousands of students and peers. Yet, and I'm going to use the term, there seems to be a deathly silence about radicalization. We wait till someone contacts us, like the police, and says, hey, you've got a person of interest over here. I think we've got to be much more proactive in that. If you look at New Zealand, there are approximately 1.4 million millennials, about 170,000 students in tertiary education. So we are a young country. But are we really reaching out to our students to ensure that controversial issues, such as radicalization being one of them, are addressed? Do we encourage students to have alternative points of view? Do we teach them how to look at the same situation and come at it from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways of looking at it? We all know if you stand on the top of a hill, you get a different perspective from if you're in the forest among the trees. Now, a few universities do have programs or courses on cybercrime, violent extremism, radicalization, the psychology of peace and conflict, contemporary media and terrorism, political terrorism, and security studies. But these are more niche areas. What I think is much more important is that we have to be able to talk about these issues. Case in point, gender. If you look at it over many years, people were not talking about it. LGBTIQ, people were not talking about these issues. Today in New Zealand, talking about such issues and acting in a way that honors these aspects is much more normalized. So an entry point for resources on radicalization can be induction programs. Most organizations, universities, educational institutions do have induction programs. Hope is that each student then can be a pivot point to take these important messages to their own communities. Is it not better to be proactive rather than wait till radicalization reaches pandemic proportions? I mean, you mentioned the UK, Gareth. Many families knew what was happening, but they were too scared to talk about it to protect family members. So we've got to also pin accountability on senior leadership teams at universities, who do seem to have an analysis paralysis and a reluctance to pick up these difficult issues courageously. Why wait for destruction and rent one's garments in the aftermath of a negative attack, especially when we have the cluster of the best minds in universities? So we want universities to know what the antecedents are to radicalization, to talk about them. We want to develop global citizens who have the tools to sift through the dross and to find the gold. That's my response to the important question you asked. Both of us are in education, Gareth, and we have, in a way, captive audiences.
Yeah, wow. Look, I just want to say thank you. I think you've raised so many key things in that just last segment. I went down to the Wellington protest or riots, and I probably am going a bit too far by saying riots, but they certainly became something similar to Capitol Hill, believe it or not, towards the end. And I had an opportunity to see the protests at the beginning, where it was fairly organised. And then right at the very end, within the last 2 or 3 days, when, you know, the park was burnt down, there were bricks being thrown at police, and it just became a horrible situation. And one thing that did surprise me on both occasions, when I had an opportunity to walk in there and amongst them and just understand what was going on, is that I was actually surprised. There were students from universities that were quite happy to be there and protest for various different things. And, you know, obviously the thing that I've talked about in the past is that you had, at the very end of those protests, you had the far left, you had the far right, you had iwi potential radicals there, you had environmentalists who were a little bit sort of radical, but they all merged together. So if you put them on the spectrum, the ideologies were so far apart, but you know, that adage that mine enemy is our enemy, that they all came together. But it was a surprise for me to see that there were members of you know, tertiary institutions that were actually there, and that caught me by surprise. And yet at the same time, they were also victims. I had a chance to catch up with people from Victoria University, and you know, students around that time were being sort of targeted. They're being sort of victimized for wearing masks, or being seen as being in that fraternity of educationalists, and being viewed as being, you know, someone that would be against what the protests were all about. So I think this concept that you're talking about, to have executives or senior leadership groups within the tertiary institutions have to take this a lot more seriously. They have to consider the potential. There's enough research out there and data to indicate that, you know, there are some institutions and universities which have been a very good environment for radical thought and extremism. Now, I'm not talking about challenging the status quo. I'm not talking about, because universities are designed for us to be free and to think and to challenge. But occasionally you find those pockets where we move from free thought that challenges status quo to radicalisation extremism, which becomes a lot more in terms of violent extremism and committing acts of terror or violence. So I think what you've raised is actually quite important. So look, I've got a couple of big questions for you before we go, because I wish I had 6 hours with you, but you don't have 6 hours, and I'm not sure if we would get away with doing a 6-hour podcast, but I'd be happy to do so. But you're on the Ministerial Advisory Group which was set up to respond to the Christchurch terrorist attacks. What could you share with us that you can share about the work that they're doing, some of the learnings? How has the advisory group sort of responded to March 15th, 2019? And when we think about the victims specifically, how has this come into play?
Thanks for that question, Garrett. I think what you said about the education sector, and I'd like to emphasize that, yes, of course, there has to be freedom of speech, freedom of thought, but we have to be able to nip radicalization in the bud. So we don't even want top of the cliff ambulance approaches, leave alone bottom of the cliff ambulance approaches. We don't want to call the ambulance. And I think that is where we can be involved as individuals, as well as organizations, as well as in this instance, the question you've asked me about the Ministerial Advisory Group. So this was set up on the 12th of June, 2021. And the purpose of this really is to be able to see how we can provide independent advice to Minister Little as the lead coordination minister, the government's response. The makeup of our group includes representatives of communities, civil society, local government, affected whānau. We have the imam from the Christchurch Mosque. We have a number of people whose family members have been affected and who have been martyred over there, and a range of other people in it. And the whole idea is we have oversight of the 44 recommendations, and a lot of this is published online to enhance transparency. We call ourselves Kapuya, and you'll notice that right through the government is now encouraging more of an Aotea-centric and a Maori-centric way of looking at things. So the name Kapuya reflects the importance of the group's work for the future of Aotearoa New Zealand. And Kapuya comes from the Whakatoki of proverb, ki te kotahi, te kakaho ka whāti, ki te kapuya I kore e whāti. Which means, if there is only one reed, it breaks easily. But gather many together, and they will not break. For our mahi, our work, these reeds reflect the different cultures in New Zealand. So hopefully, by standing together, by articulating our different points of view, and we do that with a lot of enthusiasm and passion, that we will have a safer New Zealand. By being together, we can help. We cannot help but have each other's backs. So that's really important. What we have been doing is that we have engaged with several agencies leading work in these areas. For example, the security agencies, the ethnic agencies, if I could call it that, social cohesion. And we talk to them when they present to us about what's the work they are doing. They often bring their policies to us, and we respond to that and ask questions. Can you look at it in this way? Would you be able to look at it in another way? Who have you consulted with? And in a letter written by our chair, Aria Bennett, who is from an iwi in the South Island, and I quote what she said, "We stand by our earlier advice that adequate and meaningful community consultation on significant issues remains important. And we would appreciate an update from you or the Minister of Justice on the next steps now for this important program of work." So I think it's wonderful that Andrew Little does come for our meetings. For most of them, he's there for some of the time. And people listen, they come back to us, they report to us. But I repeat, we are an advisory committee. As a ROPU or a team, we urge agencies to maintain momentum while knowing that it's a difficult start. I also want to say that government engagement with communities has to be beyond just imparting information. It has to be genuine consultation. And we do have the IAE2, International Association for Public Participation Spectrum. We'd like to see more of that happening. I think also the feedback loops must be built into engagement processes so that when communities say something, they want to know what has happened to their contributions. And this is, again, something that's there on the website. Our chair, Aria Bennett, writes to Andrew Little, and then Andrew Little also responds. And I'd like to quote from one of his responses. It's the most recent one from the 15th March 2022, the 3rd anniversary of the shooting. It is clear that we have significant work to do to create the kind of society that New Zealanders desire. One that embraces and values people of all backgrounds, races, cultures, and religion. And Andrew goes on to say, it is clear to me that we could not undertake this work without the guidance, support, and commitment of the diverse communities that make up Aotearoa. You, and this is Kapuya, have been at the forefront of our efforts to respond to the attacks, supporting the survivors and the whānau of the Shaheed, and advocating tirelessly, I will say it is tirelessly, to ensure that the changes that the government is making meet the needs of our diverse communities. So I think we do have a lot of power, a lot of privilege. We suggest, we recommend, we call into question different things that are happening. And when we make suggestions, we also ask what happened as a result of those suggestions. But we cannot make decisions. We are an advisory board. And this is, I might say, the first such diverse and such a large ministerial advisory board that has ever been set up in New Zealand. Thank you for asking me that question, Gareth. It's very dear to my heart because I think it's such a privilege to be selected to be part of that group. It's also very emotionally exhausting because we have a number of people there from different points of view, and yet we have to be able to act and respond in a way that helps to steer New Zealand for the future for our mokopuna.
Oh, thank you, Whaia. I must take an opportunity to mahi to you at this stage and acknowledge you for this work or mahi that you do. I could not think of anyone better or more qualified, but not just qualified, but someone that has the right amount of heart with mind to basically, represent and be part of that that korero, that discussion about how we make our country safer and how we make our people safer. The 51 that passed were our tangata whenua. From a Māori perspective, they were our people, and we must always acknowledge them and their families. And I deeply impacted all of New Zealand, and it certainly impacted the way that we looked at how we related to each other. So I think the work that you're doing is just so special, and I do need to acknowledge you for that. And I'm hoping for those that listen to this is that having this type of setup is actually quite unique. I've researched, I've gone across the world, I've spoken to colleagues and people within the IC community, and this type of setup is actually not as common as you think it should be. And there are even recommendations coming out of the CIA and FBI about 10 years ago saying that there was a need to set up more advisory boards or committees to address some of the crazy stuff that's been happening there. But for whatever reason it became too political. It was too difficult to put together. And so I must acknowledge the work of this particular committee or this advisory group. And I guess it probably brings me to my very last sort of question statement in closing, is that, countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism are two different things. We know that countering is about law enforcement, about intelligence, about sort of tracking and monitoring and intervening, and preventing, which is another key component, probably, and in my mind, probably the most important component about overcoming counterterrorism or extreme violence, is this concept of doing all that you can to have a society that checks and tracks and stops these sort of things from happening. So my very final question statement to you is that, in your capacity, what do you think we as a society can do better? What does the average New Zealander have to do to counter the potential for this sort of thing to happen again? And whether it's being generated from the far right, or potentially from a faith-based ideology, environmental terrorism, or just radicalization, what does the average New Zealander have to think about to avert or try and stop this sort of thing from happening? And it's not that they've got the answers and they can do it by themselves, but what could they do, in your mind?
Gareth, every question has been a loaded one, but I will just respond very quickly, conscious of the time. I think, first of all, we have to learn to count our blessings. I think gratitude is so important. It's so easy to grumble. We continue to be one of the most peaceful countries in the world. We continue to be one of the top countries in the world with reference to gender. Yet, we have so many people grumbling about so many things. So first of all, I would like to say, well, look at the glass 3/4 full or 90% full first. Rest in that. Be conscious of that. Embrace that in yourself and with your whānau. When your children, when your mokopuna, when your families come back from work or being outside, the questions that should be asked are, what did you do to make New Zealand better? Unfortunately, we often ask, were you bullied today? Did something happen to you? No. We've got to turn it upside down and say, what did you do today to make the place more beautiful? What did you do today to make the place safer? Did you learn something of interest? Can you share that with someone else? Did you talk to someone who was different from you? I'd like to think that there's a lot that can be done at a grassroots level. When it suits us, we push everything up. Hey, the government should have done this and government should have done that. When the government does do things, we say, well, why should you be doing these things? Aren't you consulting? So I would like to first talk about this importance. We are less than 5 million. I mean, if even 50% of our population does this on a regular basis, so it becomes part and parcel of who we are as individuals. That's when we have the wairua that you started out with in terms of moving forward. And that's when we will have the courage to confront with dignity, with honor, difficult situations, because we will know that we are just a microcosm of the macrocosm that is our universe. And I'd like to end this with a wonderful saying from, and I'm going to pick a European author, Robert Browning, who said, but a man or a woman's reach should exceed his grasp. What's a heaven for? And if I go to a Sufi poet, Rumi, we've got to embrace ourselves with gratitude. For each of us is not a drop in the ocean, but each of us is an ocean within a drop. Kia ora, Gareth. Thank you.
Kia ora whaia, and I've got to say this, is that we are talking about radicalisation extremism and some heavy, dark stuff, but at the same time, we are people, we're human beings, and for you to bring it back to that at the very end, I think is very appropriate. It also basically allows us to sort of continue to connect us with those that have been hurt, is that it's all about caring for others, caring for those people who've gone through these horrible situations in terms of families and the actual victims themselves. And so once again, we meet to them. And I need to say in closing, again, fire. And when for those that don't know, when I referred to Edwina as fire, it's a Māori term of endearment and respect. It's someone that I hold in high esteem. And quite often it would, in my own tribe, it would only be referred to as ariki, or people of the highest status. And so hence, for those that will learn more about the Māori language as you go through this internationally, fire is a term of endearment. So I want to say thank you to you, fire. At this stage, I need to extend some manaaki to you when I see you next, and do this properly from a Māori perspective. We must have kai, which is food, and we must talk some more. So kia ora, fire. I want to say thank you so much, and wish you the very best day, and can't wait to catch up. Kia ora.
Thank you.